Archie, maybe talk about one problem with breastfeeding, that sometimes there isn't enough vitamin C in the breast milk.
When I first became associated with Glenn Detman, we tested literally thousands of urine samples of vitamin C content. And we weren't really surprised to find that in a substantial proportion of people, there's almost no vitamin C in the urine. We rarely found an Aboriginal person who had any substantial amount of vitamin C in the urine. So Glenn then tested mothers from a reasonably elite part of Melbourne. And I think there's one woman out of 25 who had virtually no vitamin C in the breast milk. And these are elite women, not lower class poor people. And when we went out into the community amongst lower class, using that expression which is awful, but lower class women, we found an increasing number with virtually no measurable amount of vitamin C in the breast milk. So even a baby that is breastfed may not be getting sufficient supplies of vitamin C. And I think that is a very important issue. Even milk that is formula milk, which has extra amounts of vitamin C in it, may not provide enough for some infants, because it's one thing to swallow vitamin C, but then some infants need a lot more than others, and you get the odd one who needs a tremendous amount. So the fact that an infant is breastfed fed on formula milk, which contains vitamin C, doesn't necessarily mean that there is sufficient vitamin C. And I think I've already said that there are many conditions where oral doses of vitamin C don't result in blood levels that are high enough to neutralize some bacterial toxins.
Okay. Archie, can you talk a little bit more maybe about the role of white man's food and genes and other factors in the poor health of Aborigines, why they particularly...
Well, before white men invaded Australia, Aborigines, to the best of our knowledge, were healthy. Within a few weeks of contact with white people, they started to suffer from a whole lot of diseases which are unknown to them. TB wiped out thousands. Ordinary measles just went through them, killed them off like flies. Ordinary colds and flu wiped them out. Smallpox just went through them. They just vanished. They did not have the immune responses that white men had developed over a period of time. And I should mention sexually transmitted diseases also. The initial effects of this were awful. I suppose you could say that this was not deliberate, of course, but it had terrible, terrible effects. It went through the South Sea Islanders too, it went through the Maoris, It's a wonder that any of them survived. And they have never really developed strong immune systems against these various diseases. Even, if I can use the awful term, half-castes and quarter-castes. Even a lot of children that have got so little Aboriginal blood in them that you'd swear to God they weren't Aborigines. They still don't have the immune responses that the average pure Caucasian infant has. And unfortunately all that has been neglected. See, if these Aboriginal kids get sick often and often and often, and everybody thinks, and I used to think, that it was because they were not properly cared for by their mothers. And it looked that way. But it isn't necessarily the mother's fault. These infants just are more susceptible to problems under the best conditions. Now, we raised the Aboriginal twins that I spoke about under perfect conditions, in inverted commas. But we raised them in the hospital as if it was their home. We used to take them out and do all sorts of things. But in the hospital, they used to mix with other Aboriginal kids and Caucasian kids. They'd all play together. As far as I know, they probably ate each other's poo. The white babies never develop parasites in their guts. The Aboriginal babies and kids, even the twins, continuously got parasite infections. Now, this is an important observation. It shows that even under the best of conditions, the immune responses of these Aboriginal kids is not the same as white kids. Not because they're inferior, of course, it's just that their immune system hasn't been developed to deal with those sort of problems. So the Aboriginal twins, Kevin and Norman, they got ear infections, they got sicknesses, they got bowel disturbances, they got bowel parasites, just the same as Aboriginal kids that were living on the reserve.
Interesting. Interesting.
What role do you think, Archie, the white man's food may also play in their ill health?
The role that, well, what happened when Aborigines stopped eating their natural bush tucker, fresh foods, and ate white man's poison, which of course is white flour and white sugar, is very important. In the early 1950s, the renowned British ophthalmologist Dr. Ada Mann did a survey amongst Australian Aborigines, and her work was perfect. And she noted a very high incidence of trachoma, but a very low incidence of cataracts. Now, when I did my survey in the early 70s, which is 20 years after Dr. Ada Mann, I was shocked to find a very high incidence of cataracts. Now, only one thing had changed, and that was their diets. When Dr. Ada Mann did her survey, they were still living off the land to a large extent. When I did my survey, they were living off supermarket junk. a lot of Aboriginal people spent a huge proportion of their welfare money on soft drinks. Now this is one thing that Fred Hollows and I disagreed violently about. He said that the increased incidence of cataracts was due to the effects of sunlight. But you see, the sunlight was there 20 years before, just the same. And certainly sunlight plays a role in the development of cataracts. But the only thing that had changed in those 20 years were the diets. Now I did another survey up in northern Queensland, and there were three groups of people really. Well, two to start with. There were South Sea Islanders and there were Australian Aborigines. And amongst the South Sea Islanders there were two groups. Some of the Seventh-day Adventists, and there were a lot amongst them, were very careful with their food, and they ate enormous amounts of fresh fruit and vegetables and very little in the way of refined carbohydrate. But some of their relations were either not vegetarians or they ate a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables but also huge amounts of refined carbohydrate in the nature of white flour and sugar. And there's a huge difference in the incidence of cataracts and diabetes. I did a huge survey amongst diabetics, and I was shocked to find an extremely high incidence of diabetes amongst those that ate a lot of white flour and sugar. And this proved to me that even if you ate a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables, if you also ate a lot of refined carbohydrate, white sugar and flour, that it wouldn't prevent the development of diabetes. And I think that was an important survey. But the Minister for Health in Queensland at the time issued a statement claiming that diabetes was not a problem amongst Aborigines in the Northern Territory. So help me God, it was one of the highest incidences of diabetes in the world. But that was his way of overcoming the problem. He said, Archie, Kalokerinos is crazy, diabetes is not a problem in Queensland. As if when you moved across the border there was some God come down from above and protected the people. Now, I felt very strongly about the excessive use of refined carbohydrate and sugar. And one weekend in Canberra at a conference, I spoke out against the use of Coca-Cola. And the newspapers printed my comments. And a few weeks later, I got a letter from lawyers representing Coca-Cola Company. And they said that they only claimed that Coca-Cola was a refreshing drink. And if I said anything bad about it again, they would sue me. So I wrote back to them and said, well, I've seen the advertisements for Coca-Cola. I'm led to believe if I drink it, I'll be young, I'll be beautiful, and I'll get plenty of sex. I've tried the first two and it didn't work. I'm about to try the third one, and if I'm still alive on Monday, I'll write and let you know. Never heard from them again. But it's a first-class poison. If Coca-Cola didn't exist, and I tried to feed it to people on the scale it is being fed to today, I think they'd lock me up. You can do everything else right, but if you consume these huge amounts of refined carbohydrate and other junk, nothing will do any good. It's very, very important for Indigenous people because they are more susceptible to the effects of refined carbohydrate than white people. There's no doubt about that. This is why the incidence of diabetes is so high. And of course diabetes also contributes to cataracts, but it's not just the sole thing that causes the cataracts. It has a specific effect by itself.
Boy, I don't know. What about, I think something like, they estimate that a third of American white adults are going to end up being diabetic, within the next 20 years. And that's because of Coca-Cola.
That's right. They should be hung, drawn and quartered.
Well, the Atkins diet was the one reason we quit. When we quit all that sugar that we were consuming, basically.
That's good.
Plus, we had a little sugar last night in our ice cream.
Yeah, we did. A little longer. But I worry about you with your aspartame. We privately discussed that with
We don't have very much. He had it last night.
Oh, good, okay.
That has nothing in it. That has Splendid in it.
Whoops. Okay, all right, good.
We got another question.
Yeah, Archie, can you talk about the role of zinc in diet and the problems you've seen in terms of, eating disorders and alcoholism and all the various things you've observed?
Let's look at zinc first. When I start to administer vitamin C to infants, there is a dramatic response, and the sudden deaths and unusual deaths came to an end. But what surfaced was a series of other problems. And the most obvious was rather strange. A lot of infants, mainly Aboriginal, but a few whites, were not malnourished to look at or even to measure. But when attempts were made to feed them, there would be a screaming match. And believe it or not, I've seen tiny infants throw food up as high as the ceiling. And associated with that were these vile-smelling bowel motions. Now I was mystified. I did the right thing, did some tests, found nothing much, but I didn't really have the facilities to properly investigate the bacterial contents of the gut. I spoke to Professor Maxwell, who at the time came from Adelaide, and he had clinical responsibility for the children at Alice Springs. And I said, look, this has to be a specific syndrome. And he wouldn't have it. He told me that he thought that the mothers were spoiling them. Well, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And when I told him that I didn't believe a word of it, he said, I also think that the witch doctors are pointing the bone at them. You may not know what that means, but pointing the bone is casting a spell. Well, I didn't know whether I should laugh or cry or whether I should hit him or what. From a professor of medicine who had enormous clinical responsibility for all these terrible illnesses, that was his response. Well, I came over to Mexico for a conference on nutrition. And during a coffee break, I found myself sitting opposite a fellow Australian. You could tell he was Australian by his accent. And he had a kangaroo badge on his lapel. He told me his name, Eric Underwood, and it didn't mean a thing to me. I'm ashamed to say it didn't mean a thing to me. And he also told me that he was an agricultural scientist. So we got talking about cattle and sheep and pastures and so on. And I was terribly tired. I had jet lag. And I started to doze off. And through a haze I heard Eric say, cattle are the zinc deficient, lose their appetites and won't eat. I was awake in a flash. I felt like Archimedes jumping out of the bath. Eureka, I found it. I was terribly excited. That's it. I spoke to Eric about it, and he was certain that I was correct. He was, in fact, the world's greatest authority on trace elements. Now, this wonderful man sitting right in front of me, I didn't even know what his name meant. So I came back to Australia, went down to Canberra and saw the authorities. But they were hostile. I said, this is the cause of the problem, it's very important. No, I wouldn't have a bar of it. And as I was about to leave, one of them said to me, Dr. Kalokerinos, I must advise you not to talk too much about this until you investigate it more deeply. And I almost swallowed it. But on the way back to Sydney, I thought, that bastard is up to no good. So I went to the Sydney Morning Herald, which is Sydney's leading national newspaper, daily newspaper. And I told them a story, and they published it. 2 years later, a doctor in Melbourne, I think he was a professor, had a big article in the medical journal claiming that he just discovered that these Aboriginal kids all had zinc deficiency. I was extremely angry. But in the meantime, I'd received a phone call from a white woman living in Sydney, and she was married to an Aboriginal man that I knew. And they had adopted 2 Aboriginal babies. One was healthy, the other one was constantly ill, desperately ill. And they'd taken it to the paediatricians. The paediatrician said, well, we don't really know what's wrong with this baby, but we don't think he's going to survive. So they brought the baby to me. And I said, well, this baby needs zinc. That's what's wrong with him. So I went back to the paediatrician and they said to him, Dr. Kalokerinos thinks that this baby needs to have zinc supplements. The paediatrician said, you feed him with zinc and you'll kill him. Mind you, he'd already told them the baby wasn't going to survive. Now this woman was she was white, her husband was Aboriginal, spoke her mind. And she said to the paediatrician, well, bugger you, I'm going to do what Kalokerinos suggests. They were the words she used. So she gave the little boy zinc and he thrived. Now when this doctor came out with his article on zinc deficiency, claiming that he discovered that, this woman became very, very angry. And she went to the Sydney Morning Herald. And they published an article and they showed a photograph of the baby. And the headline went something like, poison, in inverted commas, saves baby. So it can be quite dramatic with a whole lot of paediatric problems. There's no question about that. Some years later, I was asked to go up to an Aboriginal community that lived just south of Brisbane. And at the time I was working for the Aboriginal Medical Service in Sydney. I was based in Sydney, but I used to travel all over Australia. I turned up for work one day with my usual uniform, which was a pair of thongs and shirts, one shirt and shorts. And I received a phone call from that area, just south of Brisbane. The grandmother was caring for 4 or 5 grandkids. And there was an epidemic of measles. And 2 of them got measles. The doctor called to see them early in the morning, and they weren't terribly sick. They sat down at the table with the other kids and ate their breakfast. And when they were finished, the grandmother said, "Don't go out and play, go and lie down." They did that, and shortly afterwards she went to check on them and found one dead, and the other one desperately ill. It happened bang like that. The survivor was admitted to the hospital, a big hospital, and they rang me up. I said, "You must give that baby an injection of vitamin C and give it quick." But no one had it. And I was lucky. I was able to catch a plane very quickly and fly up. And when I arrived at the airport in this place called Coolangatta, a very classy tourist resort indeed, the family were waiting for me, and they were not really true Aborigines, they were mainly islanders. They were fit and athletic looking. And I thought, "You're just the ones that I need." I quickly explained to them that I had the injections of vitamin C with me, my hand. And we'd have to give it very, very quickly because this second one could die just as quickly as the first one. I said, "If the doctors in the hospital don't give me permission to do it, we're going to have to storm the hospital and take it over and give it." And I knew that I could end up in jail, that I could end up being deregistered, but I also knew that if I didn't give it, the chances of that baby surviving were small. So we arrived at the hospital, walked through the front door, and who should be standing in the corridor but a trained nurse who used to work with me at Kalokerinos years before. Gift from heaven. She had seen the miracles that I had performed. She asked me what I was doing there, and I quickly told her. And she said, "Let me talk to the superintendent." I said, "Look, you can only have a few minutes. We can't afford to wait." Well, I don't know what she said, but that man came out in about 1 minute, and he was pale. And he said, "You have my permission to do anything you like." And we gave some injections of vitamin C, and that little fellow did very well. But then I thought, well, I better check on all the other Aboriginal kids in that little community in case some of them need some treatment. And the grandmother of the little fellow that died pushed this little boy, he's not so little actually, forward for me to look at him first. He was eating the same sort of food as all the other kids, but he wasn't growing. He was stunted. I had with me in my bag some zinc tablets because I was never more than a couple of minutes away from having a zinc tablet available. So I left this bottle with the grandmother with the instructions. And I said, I'll come back in a few months and just see how things are going. And I got this wonderful photograph that I took 3 months later. Because 3 months before, his long trousers were hanging down below his ankles. But now, his trousers are up to there. He's grown so much so quickly. So, sometimes just the addition of that alone can literally perform miracles. I later found that it was best combined with vitamin B6 and best combined with fish oils and so forth. But that was the one magical item. It improves immune responses. And I was pleased some years later, I gave a lecture at the big children's hospital in Sydney, and one of the junior doctors, a very bright young man indeed, by the name of Dr. Stewart, who is now one of England's most prestigious paediatric gastroenterologists, was obviously impressed with what I was saying. Because years later I read an article that had been written by him in the medical journal about how zinc is a valuable form of treatment and prevention of gastrointestinal infections in children. But the problem is, no one's using it. We've got all this information. Very few people are using it. Naturopaths do. A lot of chiropractors do. But very few doctors do. They react as if it's a poison. And this represents a real problem in the work that I've done. You can solve a problem, you can demonstrate quite clearly, and all the literature is there if they bother to look it up. But they not only ignore it, they actively prevent its use. I mean, this is madness. If we were fighting a war along those sort of lines, we'd all be wiped out.
Okay. Let me zoom out. Maybe I didn't hear it. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. But just tell us again. What these two children, these two sick ones, one that died and the one that survived. What was wrong with them? What did they have? Scurvy or what?
Measles. Yeah, he said.
They had measles, yeah.
Did you want him to say it again?
No.
Okay. Sandy?
Okay, you talked about this, and maybe I'd kind of like you to sort of maybe put it together, or I missed it. But I was wondering if you could talk about the signs, getting back to endotoxin, the signs that endotoxin can result in, and the things that it might be confused with.
Of all the complexities in medicine, endotoxin, well, it probably doesn't head the list, but it's pretty close. It's very complicated. First of all, we can't live without endotoxin. A tiny bit of endotoxin is necessary for life. And it would take me too long to explain why. But it's when endotoxin gets out of hand, the problems occur, both in infants and adults. It's produced by gram-negative bacteria, which includes a type of organism which very often causes meningitis, meningococcal meningitis. It's released in excessive amounts under certain conditions. Any infection, bacterial or viral infection anywhere, can result in disturbances in gut bacteria which lead to excessive production and excretion of endotoxin. The endotoxin is normally confined to the walls of the bacteria, and only tiny bits are excreted. But when antibiotics are used and you kill a lot of these bacteria off, then naturally the endotoxin is released. So sometimes when you're trying to save a child, or an adult for that matter, by using antibiotics, you actually kill the kid. Now, endotoxin can have so many effects that it's hard to just pick a few. In children, it results in, and adults for that matter, but you see it more often in children. It can result in various types of shock. It can affect the brain, which I talked about yesterday. It can cause hemorrhages of various sorts. It can chew up vitamin C like nobody's business and cause a type of scurvy bone changes. Cause sudden unconsciousness. You name it almost, it can cause it. I'll give you one or two extraordinary things about it. When an orthopedic surgeon replaces a knee joint, first of all, a tourniquet is applied above the knee so the surgeon can operate without blood spurting everywhere. And that tourniquet may be on for an hour or rarely 2 hours. During that time, the limb is denied supplies of oxygen and nutrients, and certain chemicals are formed in the anoxic tissues in the muscles. Now, when the tourniquet is released, those substances, the circulation comes back, and those substances are absorbed into the blood. They travel through the body. They have a very rapid effect on the linings of the gut, which allows endotoxin that is in the gut to seep through into the circulation. In the worst cases, there's total organ failure. The brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs, the kidneys. They don't live long. In other cases, you can get various complications from what they call a coagulopathy, abnormal coagulation and bleeding in the various tissues. You can get brain hemorrhages, you can get shock, you can get unconsciousness, you can get a whole series of things. Now that's an extraordinary response, where a remote condition, such as putting a tourniquet around the leg, can eventually cause a rapid onset of fatal pathologies in various parts of the body. Something similar happens to athletes who run marathons and do other violent, prolonged exercises. During a marathon run, a lot of the blood in the body is diverted from the gut to the muscles, the heart, and the lungs, so that the gut is denied the normal amounts of oxygen and nutrients, so that the gut linings are disturbed, and this allows endotoxin that is in the lumen of the gut to seep through into the blood. And one effect is to produce hemorrhages in the gut. And if you examine the feces of athletes immediately after a marathon run, you'll find a substantial number of them do actually have blood in their bowel motions. But they can get hemorrhages anywhere, and they can go into states of shock, can precipitate a heart attack, can precipitate a cerebral hemorrhage. It's all very, very rapid indeed. So it's a wonder to me that routinely after a marathon that doctors don't administer intravenous vitamin C as soon as the race is over. Should be done. A similar thing happens to people that climb mountains in a hurry. And they can develop retinal hemorrhages and brain hemorrhages.